Hey everyone, hope you're doing okay today. I mean that genuinely because I know a lot of you are dealing with a lot right now, and these uncertain times can really take a toll on your peace of mind and your financial stability. So I want to talk about something that a lot of you have been asking me about lately, and I mean a lot, and that's the Trump administration update on payments and stimulus checks. I'm getting hundreds of messages every single day. People are asking, is this real? When are the checks coming? How much are we getting? Should I be planning for this money? And I understand why there's so much interest and confusion because the information coming out has been inconsistent. And let's be honest, sometimes deliberately vague. This matters because for many households right now, extra money isn't just nice to have. It's the difference between breathing a little easier or feeling constantly on edge. It's the difference between finally being able to fix your car, catch up on bills, or afford your medications versus continuing to struggle month after month. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. These proposed payments aren't coming from the usual places like debt or emergency programs. They're being tied to tariff revenue, which is pretty unusual. In fact, it's unprecedented in modern American history. We've never funded direct payments to citizens this way before. So, yeah, stay with me here because understanding how this works, where the money would actually come from, what the real obstacles are, and what timeline we might be looking at could help you set better expectations and maybe avoid some unnecessary stress down the road. Because here's what I've learned from covering benefits and payments for years now. Hope is important, but false hope can be devastating. When you're counting on money that doesn't materialize, it doesn't just affect your bank account. It affects your mental health, your planning, your ability to make sound financial decisions. So my goal today is to give you the full picture, the good, the bad, and the uncertain, so you can make informed decisions about your own situation. Now let's start with what's actually being talked about because there's been a lot of confusion and honestly some mixed messages too. President Trump has floated the idea of sending out $2,000 payments to Americans, often referred to as tariff dividend checks. The terminology itself is interesting because it frames these payments not as government assistance or stimulus, but as dividends, like you're a shareholder in America, getting a return on investment. It's a messaging strategy, and it's designed to make the payments sound like you're getting something you earned rather than something the government is giving you. The idea is that these payments would be funded by revenue collected from new and existing tariffs, especially on imported goods. Now, tariffs are essentially taxes on imports. When a company brings goods into the United States from another country, they pay a tariff, which is a percentage of the value of those goods. The Trump administration has implemented or proposed numerous tariffs on imports from China, Mexico, Canada, the European Union, and other trading partners. The argument is that these tariffs bring in billions of dollars in revenue to the federal government, and some of that revenue could be distributed back to American citizens. And when people hear that, the first reaction is usually, wait, are we actually getting checks? And if so, when? It's a natural question because we've been through this before with the COVID stimulus payments, the economic impact payments in 2020 and 2021. Those were real tangible checks or direct deposits that millions of Americans received. So it's reasonable to wonder if this is the same kind of thing, if this is just as certain, just as imminent. So here's where things slow down a bit. Even though the president has talked about these payments publicly, including mentioning a possible timeline of mid-2026, that doesn't mean the checks are guaranteed. And I know that's frustrating to hear, especially if you've been planning around this money, budgeting for it, counting on it to solve some of your financial problems. But it's important to be clear about it because the last thing I want is for you to make decisions based on money that may never arrive. The White House can propose payments, talk about payments, and even promote them in press conferences and on social media. The president can announce his intention to send checks, but none of that is the same as Congress actually passing legislation and appropriating the funds. Congress has to approve the money, and that part is not automatic. In fact, it's often where these proposals run into serious roadblocks. Speaking of which, Kevin Hassett, who is the director of the National Economic Council, addressed this directly in a national interview, And he said something that's pretty straightforward, but also very telling. He explained that Congress would have to approve and send the money, meaning there's no automatic process here. The president can't just decide to send checks and make it happen. That's not how the Constitution works. The power of the purse belongs to Congress, specifically to the House of Representatives, which means any spending has to originate there, pass both chambers, and then get signed by the president. So, even if the administration wants to do it, even if they genuinely believe it's good policy and good politics, lawmakers still have to agree. And that's a big if. We're talking about a Congress that's deeply divided on fiscal policy, on spending priorities, on the role of government in providing direct assistance to citizens. We're talking about a Congress where many members, particularly fiscal conservatives, are extremely concerned about adding to the deficit or creating what they see as dependency on government payments. Now, let's talk about why the administration believes this is even possible in the first place, because it's not just wishful thinking or pure politics. There's an economic argument being made here. The argument they're making is that the economy has improved enough to create room for something like this. They point to strong economic growth numbers, close to 4% growth from multiple quarters. That's GDP growth, which measures the total value of goods and services produced in the economy. A 4% growth rate is considered very strong by historical standards. And they also highlight that the federal deficit has come down significantly compared to last year. The deficit is the annual gap between what the government spends and what it collects in revenue. For years, we've been running deficits of over $1 trillion. But in recent months, the deficit has narrowed. There have even been short periods where the government ran a surplus, which is something we haven't seen much of in recent years. A surplus means the government collected more in taxes and revenue than it spent that month, which is rare in modern times. So, from their point of view, the thinking goes like this. If the economy is growing, inflation is easing, and tariff revenue is coming in, then maybe there's enough money to share some of that back with the public. Maybe we're in a position where we can afford to give Americans a direct rebate or dividend without causing major economic problems or adding significantly to the national debt. And on paper, that can sound reasonable, especially if you're someone who's been squeezed by higher prices over the last few years. If you've watched your grocery bill double, your rent increase, your insurance premiums skyrocket, the idea of getting $2,000 back sounds pretty appealing. But, and this is important, not everyone agrees with that assessment. In fact, most independent economists are pushing back pretty hard, and their concern is less about the idea of helping people. Most economists would agree that putting money in the hands of struggling families is good for the economy, and more about the math behind it, because when you actually run the numbers, things get complicated very quickly. Some estimates suggest that sending $2,000 to most adults in the country could cost close to $300 billion. All right, let's break that down. There are roughly 260 million adults in the United States. If you send $2,000 to even 150 million of them, you're talking about $300 billion. That's a massive expenditure. Meanwhile, tariff revenue, even in a strong year, is much lower than that. In a typical year, tariffs might bring in $50 to $80 billion. Even with all the new tariffs that have been implemented, we're looking at maybe $100 to $150 billion in tariff revenue annually at most. So the question becomes, where does the rest of the money come from? Do we borrow it, adding to the national debt? Do we cut spending elsewhere? And if so, what programs do we cut? Do we raise taxes on corporations or wealthy individuals to make up the difference? These are the questions that Congress will have to grapple with. And they're not easy questions. Every decision involves trade-offs and political consequences. Another thing to consider is how tariffs actually work in real life. This is something that often gets misunderstood in the public debate. Tariffs are paid by importers, the companies bringing goods into the country, but those costs often get passed on to consumers through higher prices. So when you buy everyday items, clothing, appliances, electronics, furniture, even some food products, you might already be paying more because of tariffs. The company that imported those goods paid the tariff, and they increased their prices to cover that cost. In that sense, a rebate or dividend check could feel like getting some of your own money back. You paid higher prices because of tariffs, and now you're getting a payment funded by those same tariffs. It's almost circular in a way, but economists worry that sending out large payments could also increase spending too quickly, which might push inflation back up. Because if 150 million Americans suddenly have an extra $2,000 to spend, and they all go out and buy things they've been putting off, demand surges and prices rise in response. And inflation, even though it has cooled compared to a couple years ago, is still a sensitive issue. We remember what it was like when inflation was at 9%, when your dollar bought less and less each month. That psychological impact hasn't gone away. Hassett has argued that inflation has come down to around 1.6% on a recent three-month average, which is below the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. That's good news if it holds. It suggests that the Fed's interest rate increases have worked, that the economy is stabilizing without going into recession. But critics say inflation isn't gone. It's just quieter for now. And policies that boost consumer spending, like sending out hundreds of billions of dollars in checks, could wake it back up. They point to the experience of the COVID stimulus payments, which many economists believe contributed to the inflation we experienced in 2021 and 2022. When you inject that much money into the economy all at once, especially when supply chains are already stressed, prices tend to rise. Now, something else that ties into this conversation is the labor market. You may have heard people say we're in a hiring slowdown or even a hiring recession. Job growth has decelerated from where it was a year or two ago. Some sectors are laying people off. The tech industry, for example, has seen significant job cuts. The administration doesn't agree with that framing. They point to job creation numbers, especially among native-born workers, and they connect this to tighter immigration policies. The argument is that fewer undocumented workers means more job opportunities for people already here, for American citizens who have been competing with immigrant labor. If you reduce the labor supply by restricting immigration, the thinking goes, employers will have to offer better wages and conditions to attract workers. That's basic supply and demand applied to the labor market, and there's some truth to that. We have seen wages rise in certain sectors, particularly in lower-wage jobs like food service, retail, and hospitality. But businesses, especially in industries like construction and agriculture, have raised concerns about worker shortages. They say they can't find enough workers willing to do physically demanding jobs at the wages they can afford to pay. Construction projects are being delayed because there aren't enough framers, roofers, and electricians. Farms are struggling to harvest crops because there aren't enough agricultural workers. So, while some workers may benefit from less competition and higher wages, others could face higher costs for home repairs, renovations, and food, or project delays, which again feeds back into prices. You see how all of this is connected, right? Payments, tariffs, jobs, prices, immigration policy, inflation. It's all part of the same system. You can't pull one lever without affecting everything else. That's what makes economic policy so complicated and why these debates get so contentious. Everyone wants good outcomes. People want higher wages, lower prices, economic growth, and budget stability, but those goals often conflict with each other in the short term. Now, let me pause here and ask you something, and feel free to answer this in the comments. When you hear about stimulus checks or payments like this, what's the first thing you think about? Relief, skepticism, hope, or just confusion? Maybe it's a mix of all of those. There's no wrong answer, and I think hearing from each other really helps make sense of this stuff. Because when we share our perspectives, when we talk about how these policies actually affect us in our daily lives, we get a more complete picture than any one expert or economist can provide. So then, where does this leave us right now? At this moment in late December 2025, there are no approved stimulus checks tied to tariffs. There is no signed law, no payment schedule, and no guarantee. What we have is a proposal, some public statements, and a lot of debate. The administration may bring a formal plan to Congress in the coming year, maybe in the first or second quarter of 2026, but whether it passes is another story entirely. And here's a little detail that doesn't get much attention. Even within Congress, there's concern about the national debt, which is now around $37 trillion. That's trillion with a T. It's an almost incomprehensible number. The interest we pay on that debt each year is now over $1 trillion, which is more than we spend on defense. Some lawmakers have said that if you want to add a new benefit, if you want to spend $300 billion on stimulus checks, you need to cut spending somewhere else. That makes negotiations harder because everyone agrees on helping people in the abstract, but not everyone agrees on what to cut. Do you cut Social Security? No, that's political suicide. Medicare, same problem. Defense spending, not in this political climate. Education, infrastructure, veterans benefits. Every program has a constituency that will fight to protect it. So finding $300 billion in cuts is extraordinarily difficult, which is why these proposals often stall out, even when they have broad public support. Now, you might be wondering, should you plan on this money? Should you factor it into your budget? Hold off on major purchases until the check arrives, count on it to pay off debt or cover an emergency expense? And honestly, my personal advice is to treat it as a possibility, not a promise. If it happens, great. It could help cover bills, pay down debt, build a small emergency fund, or give you some breathing room in your budget. But relying on it before it's approved could set you up for disappointment. And worse, it could lead you to make financial decisions that backfire if the money never materializes. What I've seen over the years, and you've probably seen this too, is that announcements often come before details, and details come before action, and sometimes action never comes. Politicians love to announce proposals because it gets them attention and approval. But turning a proposal into reality requires navigating a complex legislative process, building coalitions, making compromises, and overcoming opposition. Many proposals die in that process. So staying grounded and cautious is usually the healthiest approach, both financially and emotionally. And speaking of health, financial stress is real. I mean, really real. It affects your sleep, your relationships, your physical health, your mental health. I read comments all the time from people saying they feel worn down, tired of waiting, tired of prices going up, tired of feeling like help is always just out of reach. They're exhausted from living paycheck to paycheck, from making impossible choices between necessities, from never being able to get ahead no matter how hard they work. And if that's you, I want you to know you're not alone. A lot of people are feeling that way, even if the headlines sound optimistic. Even if the official statistics say the economy is doing well. Because the economy, as measured by GDP growth and stock market performance, doesn't always reflect what's happening in your household. You can have a strong economy on paper while millions of people are struggling. That disconnect is real, and it's frustrating. Now, what I'll say next might surprise you a bit. Even if these checks don't happen, even if this proposal goes nowhere, the conversation around them still matters. Why? Because it tells us how leaders are thinking about economic relief, and it shows what tools they're willing to use. Tariffs as a funding source is not traditional, and whether you agree with it or not, it signals a shift in how policy is being framed. It's an attempt to fund domestic spending without traditional taxation or borrowing, and that's a significant conceptual change. It also reveals priorities. The fact that this is being discussed at all suggests that there's political pressure to provide direct relief, that people are demanding action, that the status quo isn't sustainable. That's important information regardless of whether this specific proposal succeeds. So, yeah, keep an eye on this, but don't let it consume you. Don't spend hours every day reading speculation and rumors. Focus on what you can control, your budget, your spending, your savings, even small steps. And if something like a payment does come through in the future, you'll be in a better position to use it wisely because you'll have been managing your finances responsibly in the meantime. Now, moving on, one thing I want to emphasize again is timing. Even under the most optimistic scenario, these payments would not happen overnight. There would need to be a proposal drafted into legislative language, introduced in the House, referred to committee, hearings held where experts testify, amendments proposed and voted on, passage in the House, then the whole process repeated in the Senate, reconciliation if the two chambers pass different versions, and finally presidential signature. That process takes time, sometimes a lot of time. We're talking months, not weeks. So if you're seeing headlines that make it sound immediate, that say checks coming next month or payment approved, take a breath and look for confirmation. Check multiple sources. Look at official government websites. Be skeptical of clickbait and sensationalism because, unfortunately, a lot of websites and social media accounts make money by getting clicks, and the easiest way to get clicks is to tell people what they want to hear, even if it's not quite true, and also be careful about misinformation and outright scams. Unfortunately, whenever payments are discussed, whenever there's talk of stimulus checks or benefits or government assistance, scams tend to pop up. You'll see Facebook posts claiming you need to register for your payment at a certain website. You'll get text messages saying your stimulus check is ready, but you need to verify your information. You'll see ads for services that promise to get you your payment faster for a small fee. No legitimate program will ask you for upfront fees, personal information through text messages, or payment to release funds. The government will never ask you to pay money to receive money. If something sounds off, if you're being pressured to act quickly, if they're asking for your social security number or bank account information through unofficial channels, it probably is a scam. When in doubt, hang up, delete the message, and go directly to official government websites to get accurate information. So as we keep watching how this unfolds, as the new year progresses and we see whether this proposal gains traction or fades away, I'll continue to share updates, explain what's real, what's proposed, and what's just talk. Because at the end of the day, you deserve clear information without the hype. You deserve to understand the actual status of these proposals, the realistic timeline, the obstacles that exist, and the likelihood of them becoming reality. You shouldn't have to wade through political spin and media sensationalism to figure out what's happening. You shouldn't have to be an expert in legislative procedure or economic policy to understand whether you're going to get a check. That's my job. That's what I'm here for, to translate the complex into the simple, the official into the understandable, the political into the practical. So yeah, if this topic matters to you, if you want to stay informed about stimulus payments, economic policy, and how it all affects your household, stick around. Subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on notifications so you don't miss updates. Leave your thoughts below in the comments section. Tell me what you think about these proposed payments. Do you think they'll happen? Do you think they should happen? What would you do with $2,000 if you received it? And let's keep this conversation going. You don't have to agree with everything I say. You don't have to agree with each other. Just being part of the discussion helps. It helps me understand what you need to know, what questions you have, what concerns are keeping you up at night. And it helps build a community of people who are all trying to navigate the same confusing financial landscape. Because here's what I believe. We're stronger together. When we share information, when we support each other, when we cut through the noise and focus on what's real and what's helpful, we all benefit. We make better decisions. We avoid scams. We set realistic expectations. We find legitimate resources and programs that can help, and we feel a little less alone in all of this. So thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for engaging. And as always, take care of yourself. Take care of your finances as best you can with what you have. And I'll see you next time. Stay informed, stay skeptical of too good to be true claims, and stay hopeful without being naive. We'll get through this together.